Welcome, everyone. My name is Işın Önol, and I serve as the Director of Curatorial Research at the MA Curatorial Practice Program at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. Alongside Stephen Henry Madoff, the chair of our program, it is my pleasure to invite you into the next phase of our conversation series, The Algorithmic State. As we gather for today's talk, we build upon the foundation of a series that has consistently explored the complexities at the crossroads of artistic and curatorial inquiry, science and technology, focusing on the societal, philosophical, and environmental nuances shaped by the ever-evolving landscape of machine learning and artificial intelligence. Today, in our exploration of the algorithmic state, wetware, fermented code, and artistic inquiry, we are privileged to host a new panel of distinguished thinkers, Claire Evans, Mindes Su, and Yasemin Sherry, who will lead us through a discourse exploring the intersection of living organisms and artificial systems. They will take us on a voyage from the microscopic world of slime molds and fungal architectures to the microscopic intricacies of innovative substrates that could form the bedrock of AI's future, interweaving the vast networks of synthetic sensing and connectivity. These pioneering professionals are set to guide us through the fertile intersections of biocomputing and artistic practice. We will transcend the traditional boundaries of wetware to consider its role not only as the biological component of technology, but also as a crucial element in the computational and tangible facets of future biotechnologies. Claire Evans, writer, musician, and co-founder of Vice Terraform, explores the interplay between ecology, technology, and culture. As the Grammy-nominated lead singer of Yacht and author of Broadband, The Untold Story of the Woman Who Made the Internet, Claire's work resonates at the intersection of technological innovation and cultural commentary. Her recent work as a 2024 MacDowell Fellow further distinguishes her contributions to the field. Mindes Su joins us from the vibrant academic environment of UCLA, where she imparts her knowledge as an associate professor in the Department of Design Media Arts. She has critically engaged with the digital landscape through her seminal work, the Cyberfeminism Index, offering her new frameworks for understanding the role of gender and the technological sphere. And Yasemin Sherry brings to the table her invaluable perspective gained from over a decade of designing at the nexus of software, wetware, and human experience. Her tenure as principal investigator of the Synthetic Ecologies Lab at Serpentine Galleries exemplifies her dedication to exploring the symbiotic relationships between ecology, technology, and society. The conversation will last approximately 45 minutes, followed by a session for a collective discussion. We strongly encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A feature, concluding segment. Please note that this session is being recorded, allowing you to revisit the discussion at a later time. So whether you are joining us live or watching the recording later, we are excited to have you with us on this intellectual journey, exploring the dynamic landscapes of human intelligence and the profound insights derived from the ever-evolving machines. Thank you very much again. So the floor is yours, Claire.
Wow, what an amazing introduction. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm going to talk to you briefly today about my current field of interest today as a writer, as a researcher, the thing that's engaging me, making me think a lot and making me maybe hopeful about the future of technology. And that is biocomputing. And by that, I mean computational approaches and systems that either directly employ living organisms as a substrate or are inspired by complex living systems. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus primarily on slime to keep with our wetware theme too. And then I'll touch on what I think are some of the more interesting high-level implications of this research modality. But let's start with one fundamental truth, and that is that the computers that we use today, that we know today, are basically rocks, right? That's their fundamental magic. For all the processing power that they have, even the most powerful computer on Earth is still just a complex arrangement of minerals that's been mined from the Earth at great ecological and human cost. and animated by electricity, and structure and language. So computers are rocks. That's reductive, of course, but let's run with it. So the miniaturization of smart rocks has been something that has been proceeding at an exponential pace since the mid-1960s, when the engineer Gordon Moore made the famous prediction that integrated circuits, the number of components on each integrated circuit would double with every coming year, making computer chips smaller and more powerful, basically until they hit the cold, hard edge of physics. We call that Moore's law. Of course, it's not a law of physics. It's like a self-fulfilling technology industry prophecy, but it's worked for the technology industry. It's generated decades of economic productivity and exploitation, of course. And it's fueled enough computational power to do amazing things, right? To model the climate, to discover and synthesize new molecules, to emulate human learning, to do TikTok. But there are limits to what rocks can do. Ultimately, we are very close to the physical limit of miniaturization now. We're very close to that cold, hard edge of physics. We won't be able to make computer chips much smaller without entering into the realm of the atoms. And that's like some really small rocks. And the other problem is that we are running out of rocks because demand for the high purity silica sand that's used to make computer chips is so high that we're currently facing a global and utterly irreversible shortage of sand. And of course, the supply chain for the minerals commonly used in computers, smartphones, and batteries fuels bloody conflict and exploitation around the world. So the question is, what comes next after Moore's law meets reality, after Silicon Valley draws the final drop of blood from the stones? We'll need to transcend rocks. So I think that, or I hope rather, that rather than silicon, tungsten, or tin, the computers of the future will not be mined, they will be grown. And if that sounds unusual to you, then you've probably never met a slime mold. That is fortunately an easy enough situation to correct. Slime molds are abundant on Earth. Just go to your nearest forest. The wetter, the better. Look under some logs, and you will find, in sort of eye-popping shades of chartreuse and orange, one solution to computing's intractable rock problem. You'll probably think that you're looking at a mushroom. You would not be the first. Slime molds have been mischaracterized and misunderstood throughout history. That's why they have the Latin name Mycetozoa. Myceto for fungus, zoa for animal, fungal animal, but they are not fungi and they are not animals. There's something much more unique in the living world. They are acellular organisms. They have no cells at all. And the body of the slime mold, Physarum polycephalum, which you see here, is a single amorphous cell, a kind of enveloping endoplasmic jelly that harbors thousands of loose nuclei. And those nuclei move throughout the organism in this pulsing rhythmic shuttle flow that you can kind of see here. And propelled by that pulsing movement of the nuclei, Physarum can travel through its environment 1 millimeter per second, forming and deforming its body as it goes, sending out these searching tentacles called pseudopods as it forages for food. And where it finds food, obviously it consumes it. Where it doesn't find food, it retreats. And it leaves behind a chemical trace that signals to its body not to return. And that chemical trace and the slime mold's capacity to reread it constitutes a kind of spatial memory in an organism that doesn't have a mind, with no mind, no central nervous system, no awareness that it's doing so. Physarum can explore, map, remember the world in quite complex and remarkable detail. And that means that when tasked to the right problems, put in the right context, Physarum can solve mazes, can design networks, can easily find the shortest point between the shortest path between different points on a map. And in a range of experiments, it's done just that. It's modeled the roadways of ancient Rome. It's charted a copy of Japan's rail networks. It's charted efficient routes across the moon's terrain. And these kinds of network optimization problems are known in mathematics as traveling salesman problems, and they are extraordinarily complex to solve via traditional computational means. It takes really powerful, it takes a lot of compute to solve problems that a slime mold can solve without a mind at all, with just its body. What Physarum does is called morphological computing, thinking with form. And form is a super useful way to think, not just for the slime mold, but for us, especially when it comes to tackling complex problems that traditional computation fails at. So for example, mathematicians are creating algorithms inspired by slime mold behavior to optimize computer networks, and physicists have simulated the tiny, tiny physarum to map the largest known structures of the universe, the cosmic web. And even more materially, there are researchers in Europe who are developing hybrid biocomputer chips using physarum by shellacking those protoplasmic tubes in conductive particles to transmit electricity. And so these are functional biomorphic computation devices, obviously very speculative, very much in beta, but in principle, they would be sustainable, self-healing, self-correcting, biodegradable, and by some definition, alive. And like the idea of a living computer or living computing component might sound bizarre, but I think perhaps a dead computer is the thing that's bizarre. Because although slime mold's capacity to solve complex problems and build networks has made it a really useful model organism in a laboratory context, it's not unique in nature at all. Everything living processes information, retains memories, solves problems in unique ways, and that can be thought of as computation. If we're willing to expand the definition a little bit and think beyond rocks and Boolean logic. So the computer scientist Selim Akil observes that computation is ubiquitous in the universe. To be is to compute. And that's true down to the molecular scale, right? We can program conventional computers in binary code, but life is programmed in a code as well, in the 4-letter code of DNA. And that's a code that when run can build every living thing on Earth and can store a stunning amount of information in a tiny amount of space. Just to give you an idea, by 2025, humanity will have generated 33 zettabytes of data. And if that information were to be stored on DNA, it would take up about as much space as a ping pong ball. And it wouldn't consume any energy at all. And it would last hundreds of years. So just like with the miniaturization of chips, we're actually reaching the upper limits of storage capacity in traditional mediums. But it's nearly feasible economically now to make the shift for large-scale archival data storage to make that transition to DNA, which means that in our lifetimes, almost certainly, our vital records will be stored in the vital record of life itself in the genetic code. So yeah, life computes at the molecular level. It also does so at the level of the organism. So we know about physarum, but fungal mycelium, those complex branching filaments that network below ground before sprouting up mushrooms, they can solve computational geometry problems too. They can send and receive electric signals. They can retain memory. There are feasibility studies currently being done with mycelium, looking at how to use them to create basic logical circuits and electronic circuits. And then there's plants, of course. Like we know that beneath our feet, plants communicate with one another, trees communicate with one another through these vast networks of symbiotic mycorrhizal fungi, sending chemical warning signals to one another, passing sugar, water, nitrogen, and information between species. The great forest ecologist Suzanne Simard calls wild forests intelligent systems, which are perceptive and responsive. And when her early research on this subject was published by the journal Nature in the early 90s, the editors, who were inspired at the time by the invention of the World Wide Web, called her discovery the Wood Wide Web. But of course, the Wood Wide Web is much more resilient than the World Wide Web, which is brittle and full of dead links. But maybe one day we could actually bootstrap ourselves into the Wood Wide Web by coating tree roots with conductive polymers to create living plant resistors and capacitors. It's pretty far out, but this approach of measuring and then working towards functionalizing the inherent computational carrying capacity of natural organisms and systems is the purview of a domain called unconventional computing. And it's a field with a lot of really speculative ideas. There's been papers on plant leaf computing, on lettuce seedling computing, papers proposing that we print circuits directly onto kombucha mothers, which I love, papers about liquid computers, about speculative computers that are built on the substrate of living soldier crabs rushing between shade and sunshine on the beach. I mean, again, to be is to compute. It's enough to make you think that computing is not so much a technology as it is a way of seeing, an interpretation of the world, right? So Andrew Adamatsky, who's a leading unconventional computing researcher, explains that if we are inventive enough, we can interpret any process as a computation. So if you're looking for a computer, even if you're looking under a log, like a computer is what you're going to find. The hammer seeks the nail. And this idea of reinterpreting living systems as computers in their own right is essentially the inverse of how we think about computation now, because since the invention of data processing machines in the 20th century, we have bent over backwards to make life legible to them, to compartmentalize things to fit a very mathematical, logical, reduced model of the world. And in that process, we've not been telling them the whole story about who we are. We've diminished ourselves, we've diminished life. Life is a dynamic system with lots of emergent phenomena, and it operates at multiple nesting scales simultaneously. Its growth is defined by its transformative capacity. There's so much more going on than we can translate. We've been putting a round peg into a square hole, if you will, and we're missing a lot. It's kind of folly. And we might think that we've somehow transcended that problem in some way with AI, right? Like there's this feeling you get when you interface with a large language model where it feels almost kind of feral, or it's animated by some underlying complexity, something closer to life. But the way that AI models understand the world is just an extension of the way that computers have always, quote unquote, understood the world, which is to say, in a purely semantic way, building on an incomplete picture of reality that is totally divorced from embodied and relational experience, right? AI systems are trained on words, numbers, symbols, images, and sounds, all representations of reality. It's not lived input. And contemporary AI research focuses largely on deep learning, emulating the synaptic connections of the human brain by building artificial neural networks. AI researchers create simplified models of the brain because that's where intelligence is, right? But when they do that, they only consider intelligence in isolation, as though it was a brain in a jar, with no body and nobody with whom and through which to relate to the world. And that's just not how intelligence works, right? Our brains evolved in a body, and those bodies evolved in relation to other bodies and to a greater living world. And that living world is full of evidence of many other ways of approaching and solving problems that have absolutely nothing to do with brains, which are, again, as the slime mold shows us, purely embodied. Physarum has no sensory organs through which it can represent the world to itself. It simply negotiates with its environment physically in a give and take that is chemical, tactile, bound up with the consumption and excretion of matter, the transformation of matter through digestion and decay. Intelligent systems, living systems, are always engaged with an embodied relationship to the world. And that's one of the benchmarks, I think, of biological knowing. The other one is that it never exists in isolation. All intelligence on Earth, animals, plants, social insects, slime molds, people, they all emerged as a result of a very long, very open-ended creative evolutionary process, a process through which every living thing found its own mind in its own ecological niche in time and in conversation with other minds and with the Earth itself. So evolution, time and time again, in every habitable crevice of this planet, has generated the cognition, the complexity that we seek from computing systems. So why not approach computing, or AI for that matter, from the bottom up, synthesizing complexity rather than from the top down, analyzing and deconstructing it? Why not harness and emulate and build on the onboard capacities of biological processes? I leave these questions as open provocations. In closing, I gotta rush through this so fast. I want to express to you a sort of general hope I have for the future, which is also kind of a call to the past. It might sound maudlin, but I really, truly hope that the confluence of biology and technology can sort of save us from ourselves. And I don't just mean that someday I hope that the computers of the future will be mined and not, grown and not mined, like I said at the beginning of this talk, but I also truly hope that we might be able to use those computers to understand more deeply the algorithms of the living world, like all the patterns underlying its resourcefulness, its creativity, its mutualism, its adaptation, its drive to survive, persist, and thrive. I hope that we can find a way to study the world using tools that are of the world, tools that are generative, resilient, and even alive. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Claire, for this inspiring and thought-provoking talk in the form of a lecture performance. And I have many questions. I'm sure the audience has too. But since the themes are very nicely overlapping, I will save them to the end. So now the floor is yours, Yasemin. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to share my screen. So, my name is Yasmin Sherry, and thank you so much for the wonderful introduction and the lovely presentation, Claire. I'm a designer, writer, and researcher, and my practice started with industrial design and very quickly went into interfaces. And this is the Grid Compass, which is designed by Bill Moggridge, who was an industrial designer and then kind of dived into the world of interaction design. So came the field of interaction design, which is what I do now. That field started this whole thinking around what is an interface, the relationship between human and a computer. And so at that time, a lot of these things looked like a screen and what's inside a screen. But today we might think about interfaces as physical inputs to gaming or credit card interactions that we interact with every day with finance, or it might even be paper that we might gesturally change every page upon. I've been lucky to be teaching for the last few years, and with my students, we explore this notion of interface and what is an interface. Of course, often these ideas of an interface start with what is a relationship between human and a computer, but we go beyond that. We try to think about what is the relationship between human and X, or X and X. So we try to kind of change the dynamics of what is on the ends of each side of the interface, the liminal interaction between two things or three things. So because of that, we also try to expand and think about, are there interfaces that are not digital, that are not that maybe perhaps they're physical or even invisible. So here students are looking into olfactory interfaces. And so we do practices around smelling and understanding what are language for communication here. So much of my work is around sensing, because my work started with machine sensing and working around sensors. So with students, we also explore our own understanding of sensing. So here we went on a smell walk, and one of the students is smelling under a rock. But when it comes to thinking about sensing and interfaces, we have a lot of thoughts around the physical interfaces and the biological. And because we ourselves get to sense, and so do biological beings get to sense, we dive into the area of biological sensing. And at first, students have a lot of perspectives on what is right and what is wrong. The ethical becomes the very center of our conversation. But by going to meet different people working in different spaces around biology, like Noma Fermentation Lab, which is an exploratory kitchen, or a zero waste kitchen, or perhaps a biotechnology company, or even working around environmental samples in our own studio, the ideas of ethics and thinking around how we engage with living organisms and biology becomes murkier, and our ideas of good and bad become more complex by exploring these topics. Still yet, we try to make interfaces. And so here you can see that we are building interfaces beyond the invisible. This is Google Earth. It's kind of like a skin over Earth that we get to zoom out into from a macro perspective. We also, coming from an interaction design perspective, we dive into digital interfaces to look into biological scale. So perhaps scale at this point is not necessarily large and small, but it's also from a kind of deconstructed idea of collective. This is one of my favorite interfaces called the STAR logo. It comes from Mitchell Resnick's from MIT exploration around multi-parallel universes and looking into termites, turtles, and traffic jams. The book Turtles, Termites, and Traffic Jams is a really lovely book from 1970s. And this particular software looks into actually simulating the way termites interact with one another, which is kind of like early thinking around not only quorum sensing, but also collective sensing. So perhaps sensing doesn't have to be one thing, but it could be many small bits that can have very little sensing that can build up to be something bigger. So we look into scale and we look into interfaces in these new ways. But part of this work is that we collect, we form lists, we reflect on those ideas, we make sense of it, and we make it we make the invisible visible so that we can have a chance of understanding. Part of this work has made us rethink the way we think about sensing. And often it means that we have to engage with new disciplinary practices like biology or choreography or smell sciences and so on. But along all this, we think that sensing is actually quite poetic. In my own work, having done explorations around biosensors, it's really beautiful to see just even the geometry of how proteins and that act as biological sensors can actually have a very physical interaction that is their methodology for sensing. Building biological computers can not only, as Claire also mentioned, look like a particular way, maybe in a computer software, but it can also be embedded in living systems. So here there's yeast and bacteria interacting with one another through smell. And even going further to make those things visible, I'm interested in the ways that we build interfaces beyond the digital and beyond the screen. So perhaps we could embed or explore interfaces from a very analog perspective. Here is paper that has potentially could be embedded with biological sensors that could sense all sorts of things. So the scale is a very much part of my work, looking at AI, for example. How might we look into what nature or biology could look like and feel like? And part of this practice is that there's a lot of knowledge creation and meaning making. When you go inside the scientific institutions, they have very particular interests. For example, often cancer research, which is very powerful, but I find the intersection of artistic practice, creative inquiry, scientific research, and even technological making to be really, really interesting. And it does require us not only to frame it around infrastructures of technology and sciences, but also around culture. And so as I began to work in this, I felt that writing became an important part of my research, even though I'm not a writer technically and don't come from that background. So I wanted to write about my experience of working around sensors, and very much I believe that sensing is a political act. Beyond this, part of this is also collecting different knowledge systems. And when you begin to build around history or learn about history, you learn that, for example, this is Vannevar Bush, as we may think, one of my favorite writings, which he talks about building new forms of encyclopedia being formed. And he is kind of writing about the memics and hypertext and all these kinds of things in the Atlantic in 1945. And so that's kind of like, oh, that's very interesting. I'm very passionate about how the past was imagining the future and we're sitting in the future. Still yet, when I began to research, I tried to find not only historical examples, but also real working knowledge that might be accessible to me that is not siloed within institutions. So here, for my own biosensor research, I had to look into protein data banks. And so as I built these tools and knowledge systems for myself that are scientific and technological and often very male dominated, I question, could also in parallel, there be knowledge systems that are maybe less looked into, but tell similar stories. So this is one of my favorite comic artists, Junji Ito. It's a horror manga, but it also talks about biocomputing, but from a perspective of science fiction. It's called Gyo, and it's essentially a biological computer, a horrific biological computer that interacts with digital and the physical and the biological. And it's a really interesting story, but a very different kind of story that, let's say, Vannevar Bush might say. Or perhaps this one from Panchatantra, which translates to Kelilan Demne in Farsi, a story about how different animals interact with each other, and they tell a moral, but also cultural story about the interrelationship of nature. And so I think there's an interest to think about not only scientific and technological framing, but also cultural framing. So I wanted to put these things together, and I think there's so much chances to bring these different ways of thinking and framing with one another. And I'm very much inspired by Ted Nelson's hypertext, in addition to Vannevar Bush, but also our friend, which I'm sure Mindy will touch upon, Cab, who runs Arena. And we were excited about this idea that everything is intertwined, in fact. And one of the things that we did recently with my lab at Serpentine Galleries is to kind of begin with the archive, begin with directories, begin with these lists that we work with when we come across different disciplinary practices. So we built the compendium, which is the Synthetic Ecologies Compendium. Both Claire and Mindy have been a lovely part of it. And the season 1 focused on microbial lore. And since this is a curatorial practice part of SVA, I thought it would be interesting to also highlight that a big part of our work was to think about what curation means. In this sense, we actually asked Angela Di Mayuga, who is a cultural producer and a chef and a transdisciplinary artist, to be the curator of making this kind of collecting different lists throughout working with different people, which we invited, like material researchers, fermentation scientists, material translators, and so on. And so we created a open source, open access, free resource that has multiple framings of different content that exist within an open website that we collectively brought together. For example, you might find a tweet from Bjork. You might also find history of deities from biological practices in fermentation, or you might find white papers. And you yourself can also make a collection, and to make a collection of collection. Mindy actually designed these, and I'm very inspired by her practice coming from looking into archives. And part of this is also to create different dialogues around the different people who participated in this. So coming back to thinking about this, my interest moving forward is learning to work together collectively and to bring many different people to perhaps think about these topics from new ways that we might have not thought of before. This is a book that we just did last year with Wang and Sorensum, and we created this book with 5 essays around the concept of home. And so I'll leave you with this, that we can think differently about how sciences and technologies can coexist in our society ubiquitously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasemin, for this wonderful talk. And every time I visit the Synthetic Ecologies Compendium, I lose myself in it. So it is a very rich collection of studies. So thank you for briefly introducing that. And let's continue with Mindy. And at the end, we will have about 15 minutes to discuss. Floor is yours, Mindy.
Thank you so much, Yishin, for facilitating this, and also SVA Curatorial Practice for hosting us. Claire, Yaz, and I, yesterday during our regroup, Claire joked that we're going to kind of move from wet to dry. So not only do you see this gradation in what kind of technologies we're using, we're also kind of moving from a high-level theoretical approach down to more historical examples related to Yasmin's portfolio, and now we're going to focus on one primary project and its various iterations. So here I'm sharing from the browser. If you go to mindysue.com/sharing, you'll have access to all of this content. Girls Need Modems, Rosie Cross. A gender changer figures out how her computer works, and she is not afraid of taking it apart. Gender Changers Academy. This glitch is a correction to the machine. Legacy Russell. So here you're seeing a rapid click-through PDF version of the Cyberfeminism Index, which came out last January. I'm going to be walking through how this project came to be and its various containers. Because we are in a website, all of my HTML comments read as my lecture notes. So if you inspect the browser, you can see all of that here. This lecture as HTML comments was very much inspired by the one that Emma Ray Brummel gave for Melanie Hoff's School for Poetic Computation course. And you can view Emma's HTML comments as lecture at this GitHub link. I have long been a gatherer, and though we rarely hear this word used literally anymore, we do hear its sister, gathering. We're in an online gathering today. But the term gatherer we more immediately associate with our origins as hunter-gatherers. We went, we gathered goods, and then we returned home to our kin, sharing as survival. This was some of the opening lines for an essay I wrote for the Knight Foundation's inaugural publication, Shift Space by Salome Asega. Before the tool that forces energy outward, we made the tool that brings energy home. Prior to the preeminence of sticks, swords, and the hero's killing tools, our ancestors' greatest invention was the container, the basket of wild oats, the medicine bundle, the recipient, the holder, the bag of stars. This is an excerpt from Ursula K. Le Guin's Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, in which she posits that the first tool was not the spear, a tool of dominance, but rather the basket, a tool of gathering. So not only does this reframe our history of technology, focusing on the analog, but it also helps us recenter the protagonist. So instead of focusing on an individual hero, we can then focus on the collective. So today I'm going to focus on introducing gathering as a container, focusing on cyberfeminism and 3 separate containers: the spreadsheet, the Straft catalog, and the website, and I guess a half container, the performance lecture. We're kind of short on time, so I'm going to breeze through this. And if I skip over slides, you can read through those captions in these comments. So the first was the spreadsheet. This came out, this date is wrong, this date is wrong, not 2013, 2018. So when I was first building the Cyberfeminism Index, I put it in Google Sheets like this. And this is embedded. This is actually the live spreadsheet that we were using. You'll see that when I kind of scrub through, things don't fit neatly into singular categories. And it kind of pushed forward this idea that when you try to put things on an X and Y axis in a predetermined categorical set, you kind of have to slot things into these silos, and it doesn't allow for the emergence of new categories or the blurriness in between them. There's a lot of thinking about this in Corey Teagler's Radical Google Docs Arena channel, which is also embedded here. But I wanted to give a quick overview of spreadsheets and how it kind of came to be used today. This is VisiCalc, which you also saw a small thumbnail of in Yasmin's lecture. This was the first digital spreadsheet that was shipped with the Apple II on software, or called VisiCalc, in the 1970s. But it really took hold when it was incorporated into IBM's PC in the 1980s. This is the first GUI-based spreadsheet from 1985 with Excel 1.0. This is actually version 1.5 from 1988. But when digital spreadsheets first emerged, they were considered functional programming for the masses. It was a liberatory technology. Now anyone with access to a personal computer and a digital spreadsheet could start to do some fairly complex computations online. However, quote, conventional data structures, especially tables and arrays, are confined structures created from a rigid top-down specification that enforces regularity and rectangularity. This rectangularity you see very much in the spreadsheet above. This is a quote by Ted Nelson when he was introducing Zigzag, his n-dimensional spreadsheet tool. So the idea is, how can we create a system of categorization that allows for the complexity, for the self-naming, and for the blurriness in between these forms? The second container of the Cyberfeminism Index project was the website. And here we have another reference from Ted Nelson. This is the Talmud, which is the central religious and theological text of Judaism. The center block is called the Mishnah. The columns flanking this are commentaries on the Mishnah, and the outermost column is commentaries on the commentary. So built into the structure of the page, you have this dialectic of different voices. And this really served as one of his big inspirations for the emergence of hypertext or the hyperlink. And this is that color-coded. This is actually Ted Nelson talking about the Talmud in his YouTube channel, The Ted Nelson. Visible Connections is the video link. So if you're interested in learning more, check that out. It's important to note, though, that while we do think of hypertext and hyperlinks with a digital connotation, many of this originated from printed materials. So not only do we have the Talmud, here we have an excerpt from the Whole Earth Catalog, the Millennium issue, and this cat jumping in the hole is a cross-reference, otherwise known as a hyperlink. So we're currently on page 70, but if you wanted to see more on restoration forestry, you could jump to page 90. I'm just looking at the time, so I'm going to kind of scrub through this section. So when we were thinking about our website, Angeline Meitzler, who was my collaborator, and I, we wanted to, similar to the Synthetic Ecologies Compendium, figure out how to make an open source, open access, and crowdsourced database. So this is online at cyberfeminismindex.com. It might appear to be a fairly standard table, but upon interaction, it's made to feel unusual. So as you click different entries, intuitively or intentionally, they're added to the sidebar, which we call the learning trail, which kind of builds these associative links between your selections. And because I've always been drawn to the translation between different media, you can then download this using these buttons at the bottom, which my video controller kind of covers, to get your own PDF. We don't store any of this information on the back end. We only store how many entries were downloaded at what time, but not your IP and not your selections. So for the Cyberfeminism Index book, it was also a process of translation. So here we actually froze the website in 2020, and we imported all of that into Google Docs, where my editors, Andrew Scheinman and Eugenia Bell, and I edited this for like maybe 6 to 8 months. So this is also embedded. This is the actual document that we were using. You'll see that we have red titles, green metadata, unhighlighted body copy, and then annotations were in blue. Google Docs also allowed us to naturally add some hierarchies. So we have some H1 for the years, we have a numbered list, and this we then downloaded as a spreadsheet. And Laura Combs had designed some templates for the book, so we worked with the programmer Lily Healy to basically flow all this content into an XML document and then into InDesign. So here you see Lily's desktop. She's converting our Google Docs into an XML file. And she's then going to open up Laura's InDesign file. So this InDesign file looks empty, but it comes pre-tagged with Laura's character styles, paragraph styles, grids, guides, and fonts. So when Lily then drags in the XML, it appears to magically populate about 400 pages within a few seconds. So if only it was this easy. This is the image part, but I'm going to skip through that. I think what this showed is, even if when you try to create these efficient, seamless systems, it's often very much accompanied by an invisible human hand. So while we were able to script huge chunks of this book in seconds, we found that copy editing in layout was pushing all of our content from the first column to the last column 400 pages later. So it was actually easier if we found various typos or image thumbnails or et cetera to re-script the book multiple times and then collate it together. And then maybe our half container was the lecture performance. So this was me kind of tagging through my hyperlink trails in the draft catalog of the book. I worked with Tommy Martinez to create a series of image targets using augmented reality. So this is a spread featuring Miri Magic's work. And we basically highlight a 500 by 500 pixel section. And when the camera scans that, it would overlay it with the video, which looked something like this. This was during the New Museum book launch in November of 2022. So you see this video kind of pop up over a live view of this overhead camera. Just to close, I did want to run through some concrete examples of what this index includes. It's a 608-page pseudo-encyclopedia that traces net art and activism for the past 3 decades, from 1991 to present. So this artifact is from Brutal Myths by Sonia Rappaport and Marie Josette from 1996. Women are not the guilty daughters of Eve. And they write, beginning with the biblical story of Eve, Brutal Myths describes the evil herbs that contaminated the minds of men and made them believe in the dictums laid forth in the Malleus Maleficarum. Then the participants plant a blissful garden of blessed herbs to destroy prejudicial myths about women. This is the logo of Cyber Powwow by Skawanati from 1997. Skawanati is largely considered one of the first indigenous net artists. And they wrote, Cyber Powwow is an experiment that began when we realized what an awesome tool the World Wide Web is from people who want to share ideas, images, and imaginings. The first Cyber Powwow was the launch of a web page dedicated to issues of contemporary Native art. I'm going to scrub through just for the sake of time. This is a vulva mouse designed by Andy Kurovets, and we use this as the cover image of an essay I wrote with Ali Na. Her essay was called Fetish of the Click, A Small History of the Computer Mouse as Vulva. And the excerpt from that includes, Sadie Plant wrote, discs are sucked into the dark recesses of welcoming vaginal slits, console cowboys jack into cyberspace, and virtual sex has been defined as teledildonics, also coined by Ted Nelson. By claiming the computer mouse as vulva, possibilities of bodies and sexual experiences are made multiple. Instead of jacking in, the vulva mouse clicks, offering the power of the click or clit. There's a few more in here, but just looking at the time, I'll stop there and we can continue in the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mindy, for this really amazing, beautiful presentation and all these lecture performances. Each of your talks were also a beautiful performance itself. Thank you so much. We already have started getting some questions from our audience, but before that, I will use the privilege to ask my own questions while we are gathering some more questions from the audience. So I think the parallelities and the overlapping elements between the 3 talks were actually, it made it really some of the ideas to echo even in a stronger sense, in my opinion. And from, as you described, Mindy, and as we were talking about yesterday in our conversation, from this wet to dry, but not necessarily, I think it was this an ongoing flux in there that existed in all talks. From all of your positions, I'd like to look at what and how machines are learning from these kind of interventions that you are doing through not only writing, of course, but even through design, even interrogating what design is and how it connects these different ideas. For example, your thought of gathering is a very interesting one, Mindy, that how there then the language of design is used, and how your book, not only the website, but the book itself actually does function in such way that the hypertext almost functions while you are going through the book. It is designed in such way that that experience that the I don't want to call it interactive, but however it involves my action into the book, it is successfully done through that design thinking. And also what Yasemin mentioned in there, then there is another inquiry through the design thinking. But what you said, Yasemin, sensing is a political act, and then having this biosensory research through that inquiry, that is also related to this involvement of us, the individuals, and then the way Claire described the slime molds, and what we learn from how they do the computing, and how they understand the world, and how they regenerate themselves. So my question in general here, how and what machines learn from these experiences, and how do you intervene? Also, of course, from your feminist approaches, if I may say, and it also reminds me another question that came in our conversation with Yasemin earlier about who has access to these data, and who has, let's say, the privilege to create or intervene into data sets, and how these data sets then may sort of change the trajectory of what we receive from the AI, and how it may change the future of AI. So it is a very vague question. I don't even think I posed it in a very concrete way, but I think you do have some reflections on that, how your work impacts the AI, let's say.
I have a quick response. I think that it's been really exciting being in this world of creative computation, critical and creative, because we start to see artists and designers essentially using these tools in ways that they weren't designed to be used, to really find like the breaking points of tools. I really think this is one of the reasons why we see this rise of artist residencies in tech companies, not only so they can do their due diligence of EDI or et cetera, but also so they can figure out like, oh, can we use this tool in an alternative way? And maybe this person can help show that happen. And we see a lot of examples in these talks, right? We can re-envision how computing works. We can use a spreadsheet, not as a data cruncher, but actually as a form of publication. We can use augmented reality to make the book an interface. All of these conventions, I think, are ways that we can kind of use the tools in ways that reveal research, our own personal research, rather than kind of following these behavioral trainings that these companies would like us to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would even build on that and say it's really thoughtful to talk about tools because I think people are trying to find the breaking point, but also grasp with, especially with disciplinary practices that aren't necessarily part of our education. For example, if like a person who's in the arts or in curatorial practice or in design is engaging with biology or ecological practices, I think it's the first thing you try to grasp onto is to just what is out there. And then the next thing is like, what is the tool that I can use to build with? I want to touch upon the fact that having different tools and working with different tools can also shape a perspective. So they are lenses into how we think too. So how we build our tools can also be lenses into different modalities of thinking. And I find that really, really interesting. So for example, Mindy, I think when you talk about lists in spreadsheets as forms of publication, it also makes the mind think about publication differently, or think about even lists differently. So I think the tool making itself can be radical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. I was sort of struggling to think of what the answer to this question, open-ended question, would be. And it's like, it feels to me like it's less about what machines can learn and more about what we can learn through attempting to do something with a machine. You know what I mean? Like if, for example, we're trying to build an AI system that's inspired by biological processes, then we're forced to learn about biological processes. And in doing so, I think learn to respect it and you know, have a certain amount of reverence for how complex it is and how powerful it is. The actual tool we make maybe is less important than like the sort of revelation of what we learned through the making of the tool.
I think that's really well said. Like the inquiry is kind of the most important part. Like when Marvin Minsky was trying to build AIs, he was trying to figure out how the brain worked. And when we were building these headsets, we were trying to figure out how the eyes worked. So I do think it is like a larger philosophical question of why we even start to create these tools in the first place.
Yeah, totally. I was thinking yesterday about how like throughout history, people have always compared brains to machines, right? Like brains have been over the centuries a clockwork, as a steam engine, you know, an algorithm. And the fact that that analogy evolves every time the technology evolves indicates to me that we're grasping at something bigger than we can actually articulate and model. Like we're saying, when we say the brain is a clockwork, we're not saying it's literally like a clock. We're saying like it appears to be animated by some underlying structure. And I don't know what that is other than just life itself, you know, so it's always struck me as silly, those comparisons. It's like we're comparing this marvelously complex thing to a mechanical model that barely scratches at the complexity of the very thing that we're comparing it to.
Well,
Yeah.
I really love what you're saying, Claire, too, about this moment of it almost feels like a reflection or like a mirror or some form of like, oh, that's not what I thought it was. And I think often we come into something thinking it's going to be one thing. It's like we bring our perspective. We're like, okay, I'm going to use this tool. It's going to be like this. But then when it unravels and becomes different than what you expected, for example, I think often in biotechnology or in synthetic biology, if you come from more hardware or software background, you kind of want to think like a software and hardware background and make it into reductionist bits and then build from there. But I think very quickly when you're in a lab, you realize, oh, this thing works differently and times are just different. And so even the temporality changes of like, you know, biologists having to go to the lab at 2 a.m. to take out a petri dish because it needs to be taken out at that time. So I think these moments of recognition or reflection are really beautiful part of the curiosity and the inquiry as well.
Thank you. There is a question from Kelly Lavin. What would a relationship with a contained biological computational system be like so we might allow it to solve problems in an emergent way? How do we contain it enough so we can understand it without enforcing too much restriction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I'm sort of an evangelist about the idea of biological computing, but I'm also fully aware of the fact that as human beings, we tend to just, you know, exploit everything we have access to in ways that can be really sinister. So the issue of like what the ethical relation to living organisms that are performing some function to us is, of course, like a very thorny issue. I would take maybe like what the philosopher Martha Nussbaum calls the capabilities approach, which is not to think about the ethics of living beings, about animals as necessarily like measured through their capacity for suffering or their capacity for, you know, knowledge in some way that is related to human knowledge, but rather their species specific abilities and capabilities. I think that's a really wise way of framing the dignity of living beings. It's something that can be achieved when we allow them to fulfill their capacities, what they would naturally be driven to do. So I think there is perhaps a scenario in which we sort of work with living organisms by channeling their inherent capabilities and capacities and setting them to tasks that they would naturally want to do, but simply sort of like steering them in the direction of what something that we would want to do. And I think that requires like looking at the very specific abilities of different organisms and seeing how they could be applied to suit our purposes.
Yeah, I love that. And I also think this notion of containment, just containers and containment is such a like we really want that as humans. We like gravitate towards this hyper control. Let's contain things so that they don't spread. And we're not really good at it because I don't think we are able to actually contain as well as we think. So often labs have breakouts or even the pandemic. Just think about what containment even means for us. So I love your analogy, Claire, about thinking about the entanglement. And Mindy, I really love The Gathering. It has such a poetic way of thinking about our relationship, and I'm specifically thinking about what does it mean for us to have respect and to have interest in the other side of another living organism that might look different than the idea of like containment or control.
Yeah, it reminds me of in the book Emergent Strategy, Adrienne Maree Brown and Walida E. Marisha introduced this idea of fractalism. They use it for like a political organizing approach, but I think it can be applied to this conversation too, where you basically start with the seed of an idea and you let it grow organically to see how it actually wants to scale. It's this concept of looking around rather than looking ahead. So instead of having like this clear vision where this thing has to fit into this container and work in this way, it's like we do these experiments with slime molds now. We see how metaphorically it influences other tech, and we can see how it can then change our idea of computing altogether. Yana Sutella kind of writes about this, or more of the history of slime molds to Silicon Valley in that essay, From Slime Molds to Silicon Valley, talking more about decentralization. But yeah, look around, not look ahead. It's like instead of moving fast and breaking things, we just slow down a bit and observe.
Mindy, I loved your question during your presentation. I forget how you framed it about like how you can create a container that can hold complexity. And I feel like it gets into like maps and territories kind of stuff. Like the minute, I don't know, I read something for Yaz actually about like trying to create mathematical models and simulations of microbial complexity. And like the minute you try to create a one-to-one model of something as complex as a microbial community, it's like you need a computer the size of the earth. Like it just gets ridiculous really fast. And so there has to be this sort of selective intent. Like there's always going to be something that a container or a model misses. But maybe that could be, yeah, that could be intentional. I mean, when we do that, we're sort of creating temporary arrangements for study and analysis, and then we try to extrapolate from those things. Or we make multiple models which overlap one another, and we try to find some semblance of truth in those places where it overlaps. But we never really get a full picture, because the full picture is just, you know, it's reality itself. It's the territory. Yeah.
Well, and it's also, it kind of points to the Ursula Le Guin essay again, because we then have to question what the connotation of containment is. In the initial question, it almost, containment can sound like a very authoritative action. But in the examples that Ursula K. Le Guin said as examples of containers, it was like a bag to bring grains home, which is not porous, it's quite tight. But you also have like a net made out of your hair, which is extremely porous, or it's even like a domestic environment like a home. So I think we just can consider how we contain, how we compare things at scale, things of this nature.
I think also the materiality of what is a container is so beautiful to think through. When we think about, for example, also in your essay, Claire, for the lab, when you talked about the models, I think we talk about fermentation as such a great example of this relationship with biology, and the containers of fermentation are often porous. So thinking about clay, thinking about where, especially when we think of wetware, it's literally about water. So being able to kind of contain water, but also be able to pass through. I think there was a podcast a while ago, maybe this is how old I am, but it's, I think it was on Gastropod, talking about nuns who did fermentation with spoons, and they used the same spoon, the same wooden spoon, which is a porous material, for a long time because it contained those microbes. And so I think the containment can also have these poetic historical layers that historical microbial layers that it can build within itself. Yeah.
Keeping an eye on the clock, I'd like to quickly read you the other questions that we have here. We have 5, some are comments. A person, I think Sacha, if I'm pronouncing well correctly, says, "Thank you for this moment. I'm the container." And also an anonymous attendee asked about the philosopher that Claire, you mentioned. So they want you to share that.
Yes, Martha Nussbaum. I'll type the answer in the
Yeah,
chat.
maybe you can type it. Thank you. And so here are the questions. Evolving role of the relationship between artists, curators, institutions, and public in age of AI. This is one question. Another one, I will just read you all the questions so that you can answer in a mixture, sort of. Another one is a purely speculative question. Do you think that with the internet and AI, humans are just becoming more like plants, decentralized, collectively intelligent? Are we evolving into our ultimate form? This is another question. This is by Villa Körner. And another one, how would you renegotiate a reciprocal or independent relationships with technology? And I also received another question directly that was sent to me, which is, will AI be developed into incorporate much more embodied information about the world, such as sensory measurements and the interconception of posture, status of robot's body? So aren't they bound to approach embodied intelligence as well? So I think this is related to Claire's presentation. So feel free to jump in and answer any of these questions.
Yeah, I would totally. I mean, ask any roboticist. Intelligence is embodied. I was doing some research last year on xenobots, which are these living robots that are made out of individual frog cells. They're very contentious in both robotics and biology because the use of the word robot is very loaded. And what they are really is this kind of gooey ball of cells that seems to move along with its own kind of nano free will. And the use of the word robot is just wild. But speaking to the roboticists on that project, they are building with life, and in doing so realizing how much of intelligence is actually happening, like even on a cellular level, like that humble cells, like a frog cell, actually shares some of the same capacities as neurons, which I think is a really exciting idea. It sort of means that there's nothing especially magical about the cells in our brains, but there is something kind of magical in everything that's alive. I mean, I use the word magical, it's also very loaded, but there is this kind of proto-cognitive ability in every living cell, and that even roboticists are considering that now is really interesting to me.
There's so many questions. I don't know. Okay, well, I'll say before this talk, yesterday we also questioned if I should give a different talk about AI because it was mentioned so much in Claire and Yasmin's talks. And that talk was really thinking about trying to bring in together some references related to PDOOM, OpenAI, Sam Altman's company now he's back, labor, and how we view intelligence to begin with. So PDOOM stands for probability of doom. This is what AI researchers or creators use as a way to map what their cynicism is, essentially. So 100 is high, 0 is low, and Sam Altman's ranges from 0 to 50, which is definitely on the more optimistic side. And rumor has it, this is why there was so much contention between his mindset and the board of OpenAI, which is why he was ousted for like 5 days or so, because that board was more skeptical or in a good way about AI and its repercussions. But it also kind of mentioned Hannah Bayer's latest Artforum article in which she questions why we fear AI and why this AI anxiety has emerged so much. And she does this by kind of mapping how we even view intelligence. This is related to Willa's plant question, and thanks for coming, Willa. But she says because humans always viewed themselves as the most intelligent species, even though that is proven to be not the case, and we've used that perceived intelligence to then extract and exploit every other species or resource that was considered less intelligent. We can then only assume that if this AI becomes more intelligent, then it will do the same type of colonization or resource extraction with us. So she's basically trying to map how can we rethink intelligence to begin with and kind of create this interspecies approach. And I think that maybe touches on a couple of these questions about AI and plant life in the Q&A.
Yeah, and I think that's such a important and not as much discoursed topic when it comes to interspecies, because the way we look at the tree of life, like the drawing, the tree of life, just puts not even humans at the top, just man at the top. And there's just man and just trickles down everything else. And I think we just kind of have to rethink some of our relationships, even from a abstract perspective, like the way that we draw diagrams and illustrations of how we think about different relational experiences. I also think a lot about invisible living beings and what it might be for slower, more silent kins in our vicinity by looking around you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really telling that we have often categorized the interface between biology, the biological body, and technology as a kind of violence. I mean, I used to be a science fiction editor. I have a real fondness for cyberpunk imaginations, and like those are interfaces that are just like, you know, surgeries and penetrations and like back alley implants and ports and jacks, and like these are all these like really sort of violent incursions of technology on the body. And I think those are a valid critique of like the violence of the dehumanizing violence of late capitalism, and they're a very on the nose prediction if you look at like the truly depraved animal experimentation that like Neuralink is doing with monkeys. But I guess like the alternative vision, or maybe a more hopeful vision, is a sort of, I guess, solar punk imaginary that requires redefining and rematerializing technology as something that is inherently biological in nature already. So then that interface doesn't have to be violent. It can be more like a kind of a flowing together, a symbiosis, a mutual flourishing, something that doesn't cause pain.
Yeah. Also, you didn't read it, but this in poetic form is that Brautigan poem. All
Yeah, I know.
Grace. It's like a beautiful poem if you haven't read it, the audience.
Yeah.
Mindy, one of the participants asked if you could share the Art Forum article you mentioned.
Yeah.
If you
I
can.
think it was in print, but I can try to find it.
Okay. So thank you very much. It's been an amazing privilege for me to be in conversation with you, Claire, Yaseman, and Mindy. I think there are so many other questions that I'd like to continue our conversation later on, but today we have to finish it. But some of the topics that were already touched upon here will be discussed in depth in our upcoming talks, especially Mindy, you almost touched upon the invisible labor behind AI. This will be discussed, for example, in March 14th by Josh Klein, Stephanie Dinkins, and Vladan Jolar. And our next talk will be in already February 29th on adversarial aesthetics by Rosemary Lee, Nadia Verena Marcin, and Joanna Zielinska. And we will also have a conversation between the curatorial and computation by Nora Khan, Joyce Kreise, and Helen Starr on April 4th. So our series will continue. So some of the topics that are just briefly touched upon here will be discussed later. So I hope you guys also join us so you can continue being part of the discussion and conversation. Thank you very much once again for accepting my invitation. It's been a great privilege, and let's continue our conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us. It was great.
Thank you. So lovely.
Bye.